Good afternoon. Welcome to George Washington University Program on Extremism discussion on Congress and the Muslim Brotherhood. We're going to discuss the bills recently introduced by Senator Ted Cruz and Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I am Barry Jonas, a senior research fellow at the Program on Extremism. Joining me today is Dr. Matthew Levitt. Dr. Levitt is the Fromer Wexler Senior Fellow and Director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Levitt previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysts at the Department of Treasury and as an FBI counterterrorism analyst. He is the author of several books, including Hamas, Politics, Charity, and Terrorism in the Services of Jihad. Also joining us is Edmund Fitton Brown. Mr. Fitton Brown is a senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense and Democracy, where he focuses on Arabian Peninsula issues as well as terrorism and its enablers. Mr. Fitton Brown joined the UK Foreign Service in 1984 and served in Finland, Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Italy, and United Arab Emirates, finishing this phase of his career as a British ambassador to Yemen in 2015 to 2017. He then joined the United Nations for 5 years, serving as coordinator of the Security Council team responsible for sanctions and threat assessments on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. He subsequently worked as senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project. Edmund has been featured in a range of specialist and mainstream publications and has been a commentator in news media regarding the Middle East and counterterrorism issues. He also co-hosts a podcast as well as guesting on others. Finally, we have Alexandra Hughes. Ms. Hughes is currently an attorney with the law firm of Rothwell Figg in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the firm, she spent approximately 9 years at the U.S. Department of Justice as a national security prosecutor, where she worked in the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division at Main Justice, and later as an assistant United States attorney in the National Security section of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank Matt, Edmund, and Alex for being here today. The proposed bills that we're going to discuss seek to modify a current statute which passed Congress decades ago that found the PLO to be a terrorist organization and to make it unlawful to receive anything from the PLO or to send it money. The current proposed bill seeks to amend that statute by adding the Muslim Brotherhood. The bill also requires the president to designate the Muslim Brotherhood, any branch, chapter, or charity that is owned, operated, or affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. It cites its authority. The statute's given the executive branch the authority to designate groups as foreign terrorist organizations and to designate groups and individuals, especially designated global terrorists. And that's a lot to unpack. But first, as a primer, Matt, can you explain what the Muslim Brotherhood is, to include its history, its purpose, and its organization at a high level?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, especially with the other speakers here. Barry, you say it like that's such a simple thing, but it's actually not such a simple question. And it gets to the very crux of the issue as to whether the Muslim Brotherhood is a singular international organization that can be designated as such. The PLO is an organization. And the answer is that the Muslim Brotherhood is more complicated than that. It was founded in Egypt in 1928 and quickly grew to have branches around the world, throughout the Middle East, and well beyond into the West, including here in the United States. Originally intended to kind of bring a renewal of Islamic faith, of religious faith at a time when Egypt and other countries were seen to be growing more secular, where people were deviating from the faith. Many Muslim Brotherhood branches and organizations still prioritize proselytization or dawah, and far fewer actually engage in overt violence or terrorism. And many of the organizations that are Muslim Brotherhood that have engaged in terrorism are already designated, of course, including the Palestinian branch, Hamas, but some others as well. Over time, the Muslim Brotherhood has become an extremely broad and effective group, bringing all kinds of different types of people to religious practice. And so you'll have Muslim American Society branches on college campuses. You'll have charities, some that are real charities, some that have been described by the U.S. government as sham charities, meaning that they aren't primarily there to really serve as a charity for needy people, but as a conduit to provide funds, in particular to Hamas. All of this makes the Muslim Brotherhood very complicated. Finally, just as a baseline, I'd say this. There are branches throughout the world, and they tend to be country driven. So Hamas is the Palestinian branch. There are branches in Jordan and in Lebanon and in many, many other countries. But then beyond the branches themselves, there are organizations that are tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. Everything from charities to organizations on college campus. And I think that when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, the trick is going to be focusing on branches, focusing on entities, on organizations that are tied to the Brotherhood and their illicit conduct tied to terrorism, rather than trying to designate the Muslim Brotherhood in its entirety because of the lack of a singular international Muslim Brotherhood leadership located somewhere in some headquarters that's giving direction to everybody else.
You talked about branches, you talked about chapters, and you talked about organizations. What's the difference between a branch and a chapter?
So this is my lexicon, right? But to me, a branch is kind of like a chapter. It is the Muslim Brotherhood organization in a particular place. So you can have a branch in Jordan. There is the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. There's also its political wing, which is the Islamic Action Front, which is Muslim Brotherhood but operates separately. And then you have organizations, charities, even sometimes think tanks, all kinds of entities and organizations that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that the government could have great success not trying to designate those as foreign terrorist organizations, but especially designated global terrorist entities, specifically in those many cases where they, especially over the past 2 years, have become increasingly overt in the open domain. No need for classified intelligence in their financial support for Hamas.
You mentioned that there's no sort of overarching structure that controls the Muslim Brotherhood. Is there any sort of relationship between the branches or the chapters? Do they engage with each other or are they independent of each other?
They are independent of each other and they engage with each other. There's just no systemic engagement, right? So on certain things that are particularly important to the Brotherhood, like the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? When Hamas was created, the call went out to Muslim Brotherhood branches and chapters that they should have Palestine committees. And that's what happened here in the United States. And that's what led to the creation of the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development and other Hamas entities here in the United States through the Muslim Brotherhood chapters here in the United States and their creation of what was called the Palestine Committee. We saw that in other countries as well. But that was because they all shared this very animated issue over Palestine, and in particular, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood chapter in Palestine, which is what became Hamas.
Edmund, besides Hamas, are there other well-known Muslim Brotherhood entities around the world? Are they all in the United States? Are they all in the Middle East?
No, it's genuinely global. And sorry, before I before I go further, I should say thank you as well for including me in this, and what a pleasure it is to be part of it. So the Muslim Brotherhood is a global organization, but as Matt says, there's no command and control here. You don't have, people sometimes talk, there was mention of the PLO earlier. People sometimes try to make an analogy with proscribing the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. And the difference, of course, is that those are places with addresses that actually have command and control relationships. So the Muslim Brotherhood is more amorphous than that and more nebulous than that. And it has a very strong ideological cohesiveness, but you can't pin it down to one international headquarters or to any kind of systematic communications or transmission of instructions or payment of dues. So you then look around and say, well, where is it then? And the answer is it is everywhere. It is certainly in the Middle East. I mean, you mentioned Hamas, but you've got these two branches, offshoots in a way, in Egypt, Hassam and Liwa al-Thawra, both of which are designated by the Egyptians as terrorist organizations. You've got national and subnational entities and also supranational entities. You have the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, for example, the International Union of Muslim Scholars. And Matt mentioned, in the US, the Holy Land Foundation was an example where the association was perhaps primarily with Hamas. But again, Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And, the same is true in the UK. There will be, within the UK and elsewhere in Europe, you'll have smaller bodies which are loyal to the Muslim Brotherhood, but you won't find any visible command and communication.
Is the Palestinian issue the only issue that the Muslim Brotherhood chapters or branches are concerned with?
No, it's not. It absolutely isn't. I mean, the Palestinian issue has emerged as the principal issue. I mean, I think it was certainly from the emergence of Hamas, you could argue that it became the main issue, but even more so, of course, since the 7th of October 2023 and the last couple of years where we've had the conflict raging in Gaza. And so that has become the primary motivating factor. But the Muslim Brotherhood is very much about the importance of being governed by Islam and living under Sharia law. And so that is not, in a sense, that the Palestinian issue could be said to be quite incidental to that, because of course many Palestinian nationalists have been secular, and there are plenty of, if you like, organizing issues around the world and around the Islamic world that are nothing to do with Palestine.
I want to step back for a moment, turn to Alex. Alex, as a former national security prosecutor, can you explain what does it mean to be designated? Can you explain the different designations and the consequences of such?
Sure. So it might be helpful to think of sort of the two primary regimes under which designation can occur. And I'll touch on both of them. The first one is that the government can designate an entity as a foreign terrorist organization. And this is a statutory provision. It's under the Immigration Nationality Act, Section 219. And this is an authority that is exercised by the Department of State. And there are a few things that have to be found in order to exercise and to designate an organization. Those criteria in general points are: first, the organization has to be foreign. There is no mechanism to designate a domestic group. Second, the group has to engage in terrorist activity or terrorism or retain the ability to do so. And three, the terrorist activity has to threaten the security of U.S. nationals or the national security of the United States. And this fact finding is done by many parts of the government. It can be derived from classified information, but ultimately this authority resides with the Secretary of State, who makes these determinations in consultation with the Department of Treasury and the Attorney General of the Department of Justice. After this designation is made and after an entity has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, there are several downstream consequences from a designation of this kind. First, it triggers criminal prosecution under 18 U.S.C. 2339B, which is material support to a foreign terrorist organization. And this is an incredibly broad statute that has a lot of significant penalties depending on what the nature of the support is. First of all, you can be imprisoned for 20 years or life if your provision of support resulted in death. There's also a training provision, which is 2339D, and that is a 10-year offense. And in order to, in general, establish a violation of the material support statute, the government has to establish that the individual provided material support or resources to an FTO. And what that means in practical effect is that the defendant or the person the government is prosecuting knew that the organization was designated, or, and this is a really significant or, that the organization engaged in terrorism. And so it is not required that the government prove that the person they're prosecuting was aware that there was this designation, this formal designation process. It is enough to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that that individual was aware the group was engaged in acts of terrorism. And this is often where the government hangs its hat in material support prosecutions. The other part of this statute that makes it such a hefty tool for the government is that material support is defined incredibly broadly. And this definition is statutorily defined, but it can include property, it can include money, it can include money services, it can include lodging, training, equipment, weapons, transportation. It does exclude from its definition providing medicine or religious materials, but importantly, and a very common charge in this space, is that it includes personnel, and that includes providing yourself. So being a member of a group that has been designated by the Department of State is itself a crime. That is the first regime. The second regime is specially designated global terrorists. And this regime is administered, unlike the Department of State, which administers the FTO designation. This designation is made by the Department of Treasury. And it's an executive order that allows these designations to be made. Pre 9/11, this was a much narrower authority. It only applied to individuals and groups that threatened the Middle East peace process, mostly Hamas and Hezbollah. And after 9/11, this authority was expanded. And now the authority is under Executive Order 13224, and it's administered again by the Department of Treasury. And what that does is it blocks transactions with persons or entities that are involved in terrorism. And there are, again, many sort of downstream consequences from this designation. Once you are designated, unlike in the material support context, once an entity has been designated as an FTO, first of all, it can apply to individuals and groups. And the criminal penalties are animated under a statute that is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or referred to as IEPA. And IEPA has both civil penalties and criminal penalties. It is a up to 20-year offense. So again, is the significant criminal penalties will attend this. And in order to establish a violation of IEPA, the government must establish that a person acted willfully or knowing that what they were doing was unlawful. And that's a different mens rea or knowledge requirement than what I discussed previously for the material support statute. And so in general, there are sort of three main distinctions between these statutes. There are more than three, but there's sort of three principal ones. First is who, the SDGT designation, which I referred to second. That can apply to both entities and people. So an individual can be designated under this regime. For the foreign terrorist organization designation, it's only going to apply to groups. Second is how. So this knowledge requirement that I referred to, how you provide support and how the government establishes that that an individual knowingly provides support is different under these two statutes. For material support, you just have to know that the group engaged in terrorism. For prosecutions under IEPA, you have a heightened standard, it's willful, and you have to show that the Supreme Court has defined that willfulness standard as requiring an individual to have acted with knowledge that what they are doing is unlawful. And then the final distinction I'll just highlight is where. So IEPA requires a US nexus. That is not required under the material support statute. For IEPA, you have to show that the individual was providing support to a specially designated global terrorist through US money or through some other mechanism that touches the United States. That same nexus requirement is not required for the material support statute, and that makes it a very powerful tool because you are able to prosecute individuals who are foreign and providing material support totally outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. So it's a very powerful global tool.
Alex, is there also a distinction between I'll call an FTO designation and an SDGT designation, in that the U.S. government or the Treasury Department can designate a U.S. group or U.S. person if they're engaged with terrorism groups that are overseas? For example, Matt and Edmund both mentioned the Holy Land Foundation. In fact, that was designated in 2001 as an SDGT. Is that correct?
Correct. So there is this ability to designate not just in the foreign terrorist organization context. I mentioned that first element is that it is foreign. That is not required for the SDGT context. But again, the knowledge requirements and what you need to prove in the criminal prosecutions is heightened.
And just so we're clear, the government cannot designate a domestic group for domestic activity. If a domestic group like the HLF is designated, it's for their activity with an overseas group. I want to make sure everyone understands that there is no domestic terrorism law or statute, criminal statute.
Correct. 100%. That is right, Barry.
And so, Edmund, I want to turn back to you for a moment. Alex was talking about how designations pertain to, especially FTO designations, pertain to groups that impact the national security of the United States. And you and Matt discussed how some chapters or branches of the Muslim Brotherhood are actually not violent. Are there chapters that are peaceful whose conduct does not actually impact the national security of the United States?
First thing I think I want to say about that is that I struggle with the definition of purely peaceful, because, of course, Matt referred to dawah, and there are plenty of activities that you may engage in which are non-violent, and non-violent Islamism is often a category that people talk about in this connection. But this is a matter of tactics, not ideology. The ideology is totalitarian, which is to say it's violent when that is necessary or possible. You've heard the phrase "one person, one vote, one time" as a sort of a characterization of the Muslim Brotherhood approach to democratic elections. The Muslim Brotherhood insists on the supremacy of Islam over any other source of governing authority. And that can mean that it will sometimes adopt a peaceful approach, but also that it is never legitimate by any Western or democratic understanding of the word, and that its peacefulness is, in a sense, conditional. So I wanted to mention that in particular. Now, we can go through, I want to sort of perhaps take the opportunity to promote some work that the Foundation for Defense of Democracies has done recently on a number of overseas branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, starting with Egypt, of course, where you had a leader, a president in Mohammed al-Morsi, who was actually elected as president of Egypt and then was displaced in a military coup. Now, that is an interesting one to look at because, the election was a reasonably fair election. Morsi took over as president, and then he was removed, in a sense, outside the boundaries of the electoral system. So, that a lot of people would look at that and question whether that was the right thing. But you also see there the violent splinter groups that I've talked about that have come from the Muslim Brotherhood and which have been involved in terrorist activity in Egypt. In Jordan, you have a branch that appeared to reject violence, but it planned a major attack that the authorities just disrupted in April this year. In Lebanon, where the Muslim Brotherhood operates as the Islamic group, they fought by Hezbollah's side against Israel in the recent conflict. So you've got this sort of movement between peaceful and violent, depending upon the tactical requirements of the moment. Moving to Sudan briefly, which was another one that we looked at closely. Their vehicle is the Sudanese Islamic Movement, SIM. That's now a party to the country's civil war. And, Washington, D.C. has in fact sanctioned a pair of top SIM leaders, but not the organization as a whole. And then in Yemen, you've got the Brotherhood operating as Al-Islah Party. And that's now part of Yemen's internationally recognized government. And I saw the complexity of that close up when I was the British ambassador to Yemen. So you could have somebody like the then Vice President, Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar, who was very definitely a sort of a hawk against the Yemeni Houthis. But you have elements within the Islah Party who are cooperative with the Houthis. And again, the Houthis being a terrorist group by US designation. I think that's well, I'll leave it there. But my point is that you might have a temporary appearance of peacefulness, but that cannot be relied upon.
So you mentioned some groups, Egypt's probably the best example, where the Muslim Brotherhood became the government or or part of the government. I would imagine that if the U.S. government designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole as what these statutes proposed, it could make it difficult for the U.S. government to engage with other foreign governments where the Muslim Brotherhood is part of the political machinery. Matt, what's your thought on that?
Look, yes and no. On the one hand, yes, it could make things quite complicated, but more so with governments that are themselves closely affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, the government in Turkey, the government in Qatar in particular, which are both governments that the administration is close to, governments where the United States has a lot of other interests. We have found ways to communicate and deal with the Palestinian government when it was led by Hamas after it won the election in early 2006. We've found ways to communicate with the Lebanese government, even though it's included members of Hezbollah in the government and in the parliament. It can complement our ability to deal directly with certain persons and sometimes certain parties, but unless the designated entity is running the entire government, we've found ways around that. I do think that there are some political and policy complications when it comes to governments like Turkey and Qatar, which are themselves close to the Muslim Brotherhood and very close to many branches and many of the types of member organizations that we've been talking about.
Matt, you mentioned earlier that Hamas moving away from governments itself that the Muslim Brotherhood may be affiliated with. Besides Hamas, and I know Edmund mentioned a couple, what other Muslim Brotherhood chapters or branches have already been designated by the U.S. government?
Very few. We have the two Egypt-based, really breakaway entities that were designated under the first Trump administration that Edmund mentioned earlier. I think if the administration were to go forward now, and assuming, as I understand, that the administration really wants to do this under a counterterrorism type of authority rather than coming up with some type of new executive order, and given the difficulties of designating the Muslim Brotherhood writ large in something like the PLO, or just expanding the authority that banned the PLO to include the Muslim Brotherhood. To me, the way to do this is two-part. One, there are Muslim Brotherhood branches. Edmund mentioned two, and I've discussed this before, that could be designated now based on activity that they've taken since the first Trump administration and Trump's dealing with this last time. And that is the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood branch, which was just banned by Jordan itself, and the Lebanese branch, which actually has a military wing and has carried out rocket attacks and has participated, worked closely both with Lebanese Hezbollah and with Hamas. We should look at other cases, whether it's Sudan or elsewhere. There may be other cases where an actual branch or organization does engage in violence and can be designated. I'm talking here as an FTO. That's possible, but that shouldn't be enough. There is so much evidence, especially over the past 2+ years, of Muslim Brotherhood entities around the world that have been very, very clearly financing Hamas. Cases around the world that we can point to, and this should be very clear in the ability to designate those as specially designated global terrorist entities under the guidelines that Alex very, very clearly just laid out. So, for example, Barry, when the Israelis went into Gaza, into the tunnels, into Hamas hideouts, they uncovered a tremendous amount of documentation. That documentation points to some of these organizations that we're talking about, like the Popular Conference for Palestinians Abroad. And there is documents found in the Hamas tunnels tying this Muslim Brotherhood organization to funding Hamas. The German government several years ago banned the German branch of IHH, a Turkish Muslim Brotherhood kind of charity organization, for its financing of Hamas. And the IHH since has been very, very overt in not only its pro-Hamas stance, but the evidence of its financing of Hamas, I think, is quite clear. You have other examples. I think Edmund mentioned earlier the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe. A criminal case in Spain in 2019 pointed to this Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organization and its ties to Hamas. And there are many other examples like it. This is just with open source information. As Alex noted, the government is able to rely on classified information for these as well. And so, to my mind, the way to really begin to hold the Muslim Brotherhood accountable for acts of violence and for financially and materially supporting violence is by targeting those entities that have carried out acts of violence or are financing them. And that then gives the government a tremendous amount of opportunity to look at Muslim Brotherhood organizations, and there are so many in this country and abroad that are providing that type of support to violence around the world that affects U.S. interests, that has a foreign component to it. It works within the law. And let's be honest, the Trump administration, in the first time around, they wanted to designate the Muslim Brotherhood in its entirety as an FTO, and they found out that it didn't hit threshold. This time around as well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has testified before Congress that effectively saying it's hard to hit threshold. You got to show your work before the court, and we don't have work to show. This is the way to do it. There are branches that could be designated as FTOs, and if you didn't want to do it that way, you could easily designate them as under the 13224 executive order. But then certainly these other organizations, some of which, by the way, have already been designated by the Treasury Department for support for Hamas without mentioning their Muslim Brotherhood affiliation, a tranche of designations of charities in North Africa and the Middle East and Europe just a few months ago, which the Treasury Department explicitly described, quote, as sham charities, most of which are very, very clearly Muslim Brotherhood organizations. There is a way forward here that works within the law and can be done under counterterrorism authorities to underscore the real national, I would say international security risks posed by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the final thing, just to follow up on something Edmund was saying, is this idea that there's reason to be concerned about Muslim Brotherhood organizations, even those that have not expressly engaged in or expressly supported or financed terrorism. And that's not something new. The Dutch intelligence service several years ago wrote a report. It's available online still today in Dutch and in English, looking at their concern about Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations that are preaching proselytization, dawah, as they put it, in the country. And the concern isn't just with those that are supporting or engaging in violence, but those that are trying to undermine democracy from within for the express purpose of engaging in activities to infiltrate institutions, to be able to undermine democracy from within. These organizations are inherently anti-democratic, and that's reason for concern. It doesn't mean that we can use counterterrorism authorities against, say, a branch that is doing bad things that aren't violent or terrorist, but it does mean that we can target those brotherhood organizations that are. This starts the ball rolling in a really meaningful way.
Matt, you said a lot. I want to unpack some of what you said. I want to work backwards. You said from within was the term you used, and that struck a chord with me. If I remember correctly, there were documents presented in the HLF trial that talked about that very idea, going back 30-something years, about undermining democracy from within. And this is a Muslim Brotherhood organization in the United States, which we offhandedly call Hamas in America, that was putting forward that very notion. The other thing you said, you referenced Marco Rubio and his comment about we have to show our work in court. Alex, if I can turn to you real quickly, a group gets designated. Can they challenge that designation in court?
No, I mean, that is a curious comment. I'd say like the way that this presents itself in the criminal context, for example, is that if you have a broad designation, and Matt has articulated sort of the ways in which this entity operates, and there are some downstream consequences of that in a criminal case, you can quite see someone who would be charged with material support to the Muslim Brotherhood saying, I thought I was contributing to my trash pickup. I had no idea. And it'd be incumbent on the government in a material support case, for example, to show that they were aware that the specific branch or entity in the Muslim Brotherhood they're contributing to was engaged in acts of terrorism. And if you have these sort of filler activities that these groups are engaged in that are more sort of bureaucratic in nature, the governance piece of this, and you can't show that a particular individual was aware of the terrorism components of a particular group or governing entity, then the government is going to lose that case. And so there is this real risk of this being challenged in court through the criminal cases. And again, as I described, these are really strong statutes, and to the degree you're going to dilute them by overreaching and allowing defendants to raise these types of defenses is a real risk.
And so, and just so we're clear, what you're referring to is if someone is charged, an individual in the United States is charged with providing material support to a designated entity, in this case, it could be the Muslim Brotherhood. Government has this burden to meet of knowledge that they know they're providing support to the Brotherhood and that the Brotherhood is designated or the acts underlying that designation, which is a high bar to meet. Putting that aside for a moment, what about the Brotherhood's ability to challenge the designation in court? Can they bring a civil action to challenge the designation?
So, I mean, they can, there is a publishing period at which point there is an ability to bring, I think you can contest it, but I'm not sure that that is the way this would actually be challenged, of the like that Rubio was talking about.
And so when someone is charged, they don't have the ability to challenge a designation. In other words, if someone's charged with providing material support, they can then, they're not allowed to go into court and as a defense say the Muslim Brotherhood should never have been designated in the first place, and here's why. That's not something they can do. They can just challenge and say, I didn't know they were designated. I didn't intend to provide support to a designated entity. I know that the HLF, the Holy Land Foundation, when they were designated as a specially designated global terrorist, they did bring a lawsuit in federal court in Washington, D.C., challenging that designation, and they lost. The bar was not very high for the government to meet in doing the designation. The government presented to the court both a classified file and an unclassified file. And of course, the defendants could not see the classified file. And the court upheld, said that the government met its burden of that case. Now, that's not a criminal case where the burden is much higher beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil matter, in an administrative matter, it's much easier for the government to establish the basis for the designation. Can I pivot for a moment? Both Matt and Edmund, you talked about certain countries doing designations. Matt, you mentioned, I think, Germany designating the IHH. Is that correctly? Was that Turkey?
Yeah.
It was Germany. Yeah. Edmund, from your perspective, you're a former ambassador for the United Kingdom. You're from Europe originally. What's Europe's take on the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah, so I mean, if I can offer a sort of a European take, but also a Middle Eastern take, because I think that's also obviously highly relevant here. Because if we're looking at the countries that have outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood, then we should mention, of course, Egypt has been mentioned already, Jordan has been mentioned already, but also Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Those have also designated it as a terrorist organization. Then, as we said, Austria banned the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was 4 years ago, classifying it as a terrorist organization. Bahrain actually is also another one on the list that has banned it as a terrorist organization. Bahrain really follows Saudi Arabia and UAE pretty closely. And then just recently we had the Germans banning this group called Muslim Interactive, which is, again, not necessarily the same as banning the Muslim Brotherhood, but it was something that the Germans felt the need to ban. And I think where this is interesting in terms of what we're reflecting on here, we should probably leave aside the Middle East, because in these Middle Eastern countries that we've referred to, it can be useful in terms of, if the Jordanian branch is banned, as Matt says, that gives you a very clear FTO option. You just say, well, this is a violent group that has been banned in Jordan, and we're going to ban it too. But in terms of, if you like, following the example of what's been done elsewhere, Middle East doesn't work terribly well because you don't have the same form of legal challenge operating there. And if you're a Middle Eastern autocracy, even an ally of the United States, you have a freedom of action to suppress your opponents in a way that the US and Europe does not have. So it's interesting then to look directly at Europe, as you suggested. And Austria obviously is an interesting one. That's a sort of a pioneer in a way, and perhaps to some degree gives us an idea of what we might expect to happen in the US. Again, important to make distinctions between European law and American law. Some of your particular concerns in America, particularly to do with the First Amendment, sometimes to do with religious freedom, may not be fully reflected in the considerations under various branches of European law. So in purely practical terms, the suggestion is that the law in Austria has not done a great deal of harm. It's subject to challenge, of course, but what people are saying is that it hasn't yielded much in the way of tangible results. And I think in a way that goes back to the point that Matt and Alex were making, which is this actually the way to get things done?
So you set up the next question. What do you suggest? How do you suggest the U.S. government go about achieving the goal that Congress is trying to achieve by designating the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I mean, I want to hesitate to do too much in the way of recommending to the US from the perspective of a Brit. I do look at this to a large degree from a British point of view. One of the important things that I think needs to be made, a point that needs to be made is that a real problem has arisen in Britain and in Europe in terms of, again, this has really been sort of brought to light by the Gaza crisis and the sort of protests that has yielded over the last 2 years. We've had a lot of disruptive demonstrations that have then deliberately targeted Jewish institutions and Jewish communities, and an explosion of anti-Semitic activity, which is regarded as a big problem in the UK and in parts of Europe as well. And the one other sort of interesting comparison to be made is the UK is quicker to reach for proscription, I think, than the US. We proscribed Palestine Action recently, and that was obviously in many ways related to the demonstrations that we have seen. That was interesting to see the reaction to that in the UK, because it was proscribed as a terrorist organization, and most of the objection to that has been around whether it really fits the definition of a terrorist organization. And of course, the British government's argument was that it does fit that definition because of action that the group took against a UK airbase. And that was judged to be terrorist activity, but it was non-lethal. It didn't. There were no casualties from. You could argue that it was vandalism, but nevertheless the government chose to define it as terrorist activity. So it's a controversial decision, and it's not totally clear whether it will stand. So coming back to the US point of view, I'm very attracted to the way that Matt is approaching this, and the idea that you can identify on solid grounds a number of branches of the Muslim Brotherhood who can be identified as terrorist organizations. The last point I want to make, and this applies equally well in any jurisdiction, including in the United States, and definitely from my own experience in the United Kingdom, and this is about the resources. And Matt hinted at this, I think, earlier when he said about the government having access to classified insights, which we would perhaps not have. There is also the question of ownership of the issue. Now, when I served abroad in Egypt in the 1990s, so we're now talking about 30 years ago, the Egyptians were warning the British government relentlessly, repeatedly, about the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat in the United Kingdom. The response from the United Kingdom tended to be, we don't see politics the way you do. We think that you're trying to suppress political dissent, and therefore, we're not going to take the action that you're asking for. And then we had similar disagreements with the Saudis at different times and with the United Arab Emirates at different times. There is, however, a problem here, and that is that governments and their agencies and departments, they get overloaded very quickly. So if you're dealing with counterterrorism and you feel like you're overloaded with ISIS or Al Qaeda, the last thing you're going to want to do is to accept responsibility for another group that you judge doesn't fit your criteria. So you end up with Islamist entryism, as some people call it, or non-violent Islamism, as some people call it, various groups that do not meet the sort of the Al Qaeda or ISIS threshold as terrorists. As orphan subjects, nobody wants to handle that subject. And of course, if nobody handles it, then you don't gain the evidence that you need. And so one of the things that does need to be looked at, certainly in the United States, because you've had the same problem with people not wanting to own this issue. Is it a problem? Yes. But whose problem is it?
That's a really good point. You said a couple of things. I want to turn back to Alex for a moment. Alex, Edmund mentioned the First Amendment that we have here in the United States, freedom of speech. Have you seen in your experience as a prosecutor, people raise the First Amendment as a defense to providing material support to a terrorist group?
In short, all the time. It is one you can bank on in this space. And it is part and parcel of the deal we make here of having the freedom of speech. And the government has, in bringing these cases, we have to show that what the individual is doing is beyond just speech. You can say, I support Hamas. You cannot join Hamas. That distinction is one that is easy to say, but can be difficult to articulate and prove in our cases. And so that is the oldest book in this game, and it's the oldest book because it raises significant constitutional protections that we all want to rely on. And so how you show one's membership, knowing that organization commits acts of terrorism, is where a lot of all these cases rise and fall.
And hasn't the Supreme Court said that speech is not necessarily verbal? It can be acts as well. And if someone provides services to a terrorist group, the argument is, well, I'm exercising my speech by doing X that could be considered a service. But the Supreme Court has said if you're providing services, yes, it may be speech, but if you're doing so at the direction or control of the terrorist group, that is not protected speech. That is a crime.
Correct. And so what really becomes a key part of these cases is the degree to which an individual is acting, as you said, at the direction and control of the organization. And there is a case law that first was articulated by the Supreme Court and has been adopted by circuits that says that independent speech alone is not prosecutable. So again, the statement I started off with, I support Hamas, these sort of statements in isolation, not prosecutable. But as soon as your statements, and even to include speech alone. So if you're engaged in speech, but that speech is being directed and controlled by an FTO, you are still subjected to criminal violations depending on the nature of that directionality.
And I don't want to get too much into a law school class, but just so we're clear, direction and control doesn't mean that someone from Hamas or another designated group sits down with you one-on-one to tell you what to do. It could be the terrorist group pushing out a message to its worldwide followers, a broad message, and someone says, I'm going to follow that and conduct this act, this service, whatever.
Right. Yes, there does not need to be a direct link between, it is not required. And again, sort of in the spate of we call them lone wolf attacks of individuals who sort of in the privacy of their home in the heyday of ISIS pledged allegiance to ISIS and then went out and committed an act without having ever engaged directly with ISIS. Those cases were still charged as material support cases. And so you don't actually need to have made contact with the foreign terrorist organization. And in fact, the statute includes an attempt and a conspiracy charge, which sort of has different applications depending on the nature of your facts.
I'm not going to follow up on that because we'll go down a road I don't think we want to. But let me turn, before we turn to questions, we've got about 10 minutes left. Matt, is there anything you want to add to the discussion that we haven't covered?
Discussion has been great. I just want to make a couple of quick points. First is, Edmund, just to follow up on your comments on Europe and the UK, in 2015, the British government issued a report in which it expressly accused the Brotherhood of deliberately, wittingly, and openly, that's a quote, sustaining Hamas and facilitating its funding, and underscored the ongoing linkages between Hamas and the Brotherhood branches and organizations throughout the Middle East. This is not new. If I were tasked with trying to implement the policy that I'm recommending, which is looking for those parts of the Muslim Brotherhood world that have engaged in violence as potential FTO designations, as the Trump administration did in the first term, looking at some that would now qualify again in its second, and then looking at the other Muslim Brotherhood entities that are supporting Hamas or other groups that are FTOs for specially designated global terrorist entity designations. One thing I would do, for example, is I'd start with something like the Union of Good. Treasury Department designated the Union of Good years ago as a specially designated global terrorist entity. And when it did so, it declassified information revealing that it was created by Hamas leaders for the purpose of being a channel through which people and organizations could donate money to Hamas. That's why it was created, by Hamas leadership. It was founded by Yusuf Qaradawi, who was one of the most prominent Muslim Brotherhood leaders until he passed away, Egyptian who found safe haven in Qatar and lived in Qatar for many, many years. Union of Good still functions. Many, many Union of Good member organizations have been designated. Many others have not. I would start there and I would go on down. I mean, just open source OSINT research alone will reveal, and especially over the past 2 years, where support, not just for needy Palestinians, which of course is legitimate, and a lot of people want to do the right thing in the context of what's been a devastating war in Gaza and just help people. But there's also been a lot of people feel more comfortable financing Hamas. And on top of that, there's been a lot more of, again, what the Treasury Department described as sham charities, saying they're raising funds for needy Palestinians, but that are actually doing so in whole or in part for Hamas. There's a lot of information out there that we could be using to move this policy forward, to identify entities that could be listed really quite quickly, and in a way that would address Secretary Rubio's concern about having to show his work to the court, in a way that would not get to First Amendment issues and would begin to give the government an ability to address the real threats, and they are real threats that are posed by the Muslim Brotherhood and its constituent elements.
Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot real quick. You talked about sham charities and some people want to give for legitimate reasons. How would someone who's concerned about donating to a sham charity that's not designated go about figuring out whether or not this charity is legitimate, or finding charities that are legitimate? Is there a white paper that the government publishes on this sort of thing?
Yeah. Barry, you know my line on this. That's why you asked it this way. There is no white paper. The government issues black papers, and those black lists do not include everything out there. And there certainly is no white list, because that would just tell the bad guys where to go next, what group to infiltrate next. But you are able, and I don't mean to make it out like this is simple, but for example, when I looked at the list of the sham charities that Treasury designated a few months ago, all of them were organizations about which there was derogatory information available in the open source by doing some basic Google searching. A person is able to do some basic due diligence. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of very good Muslim American organizations in particular, that are trustworthy and through whom one can donate to needy causes around the world, including needy causes that are legitimate causes that are based in war zones. And so you need to start with that due diligence. And it's not like it's going to be perfectly easy. I appreciate that very much. But it's also the case that, you know, whether you're giving to charity in Gaza or you're giving to charity in Washington, D.C., you need to do a little bit of due diligence, because there are a lot of bad actors out there in general, and a little bit of due diligence goes a long way.
I'm going to turn to the questions. And the first one, and I'm going to mispronounce these names. Can you comment on where you place Rashid, R-A-C-H-I-D? I'm going to spell the last name, G-A-N-N-O-U-C-H-I, and the Ennahda Party. Matt, do those ring a bell?
Edmund, you want to start on Ranushi?
Ranushi and the Al Nahda Party. So I think one of the things that was interesting from earlier was when we were talking about where the Brotherhood had actually been in government, and Ennahda Party did actually get into government in Tunisia. It isn't anymore.
Matt, you want to add anything?
Yeah. Yes, what he said.
Okay. The next question, Matt, in your view, does CAIR meet the requisites needed for a terror designation?
CAIR, C-A-I-R, the Council on American Islamic Relations. I think there's a tremendous amount of information out there about some of the individuals, some of the leaders, their affinity for Hamas. They were an unindicted co-conspirator in the HLF case. I think CAIR would be one of those organizations that people would want to take a look at. Whatever organization you're looking at, however, they must meet the threshold. It cannot be enough to say someone is saying something that you disagree with. So, do you have evidence in the open source or in the classified? Can you start investigations that would find some evidence that would be able to identify a particular organization as a candidate for designation as an FTO or as a specially designated global terrorist entity? In each and every one of these, the government's going to have to look and see what evidence it finds and does it meet threshold. And it's not enough to say it's a nasty organization that says really nasty stuff and has had leaders that said things that were pro October 7th, and they've hosted Hamas people and they've hosted people who liked October 7th. That in itself is not necessarily going to be enough. But I would not be surprised if a lot of people say we need to take a look at CAIR.
Question is, are there a couple of opportunities you see in where data could be built on less clearly designated groups? I think, Matt, your answer a moment ago would apply to that as well.
Yeah, look, I think certainly in the classified space, but in the unclassified space, there's tremendous opportunity here to dig into these organizations and to then see who are the entities that are supporting them and what are they doing. One needs to appreciate that in the open source world, you're going to often be limited by what you can find. You're certainly going to be limited in terms of finding the quote unquote sham charities, the ones that are saying things publicly, online, at events in one way, but then doing things behind closed doors another way. But there's a lot of opportunity to do this. And there are lots of organizations that are doing it. In fact, I see the person who's asking the question is one of them. So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to do more work in the space in the open source world. In an age of social media, there's tremendous amounts of material out there.
One thing that occurs to me, though, is resources. That there are limited resources. The Muslim Brotherhood is not the only organization that the government focuses on in terms of the Treasury Department and designations and sanctions. There's elements of Russia at certain points in the past several years, elements of China. And so I would imagine that the government has to pick and choose where it wants to focus. It can't just focus on every group. And Matt, you were former Treasury. I assume, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's absolutely the case. There are still only 24 hours in the day, and almost no requests from the top come with more full-time employees or the money to fund them. Edmund talked about this in the UK case, and I've had meetings with British officials many times where they said exactly as Edmund did. Look, we are inundated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS cases. We don't have the time to do everything. Here in the United States, we do throw more people and more money at a problem than our colleagues do across the pond. And even here, you can't do everything. So things are going to have to be prioritized. And if the government wants this to be a priority on top of Iran, China, Russia, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Iran sanctions are back on the table, then they have to make the resources available if they want there to be near-term progress.
Do you guys have a couple of minutes for two more questions? Yeah. Would you expect the Qataris, Turks to try to block any designation of the Muslim Brotherhood? Matt?
I saw Edmund starting. Go ahead, Edmund.
Edmund, go ahead.
Well, I mean, of course, neither the Qatari government nor the Turkish government particularly welcomes dissent, and they're not looking for their own sort of versions of the Muslim Brotherhood to put them under pressure in terms of their own in Turkey in terms of its electoral sort of success, and in Qatar in terms of challenging the rule of a ruling family. So it's a curious sort of schizophrenic attitude that they have, that they're attracted to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, although they themselves would not particularly want the Muslim Brotherhood to be telling them what to do internally. I think in terms of creating difficulties for the US over this, I think they would. I would expect them to operate behind the scenes on this. Yeah, I'm sure that you would see plenty of activity that would be supported by, maybe funded by the Qataris and perhaps by the Turks. I don't think that either of them would want to stick their necks up and say to the US, "You're getting this wrong."
Look, I do, if I could just add, I do think it'll get sticky if either the administration decides in one way or another to try and ban the Muslim Brotherhood writ large, because that's going to step on all kinds of toes there. And it gets sticky even if the administration were to take a more targeted approach of the type that we're recommending here, if they were to look at entities that are based in Turkey or Qatar and or are close to the regimes there. IHH is a great example. IHH is quite close to the Erdogan regime, and that would ruffle some feathers. There are entities in Qatar, I'm sure, that could be put on a list of entities to be looked at, and that would give Qatari officials some discomfort. But like you said, Barry, there is neither the capability, the bandwidth to do everything at once, nor necessarily the interest. You can pick and choose. And I think there would be an opportunity if the administration were to do this and go forward with a distinct list of entities, and then approach in quiet diplomatic channels countries like Turkey and Qatar and say, listen, we're not designating the Muslim Brotherhood writ large, but here are the types of activities we're no longer going to sit by and allow to happen in general, certainly in our countries. And you now need to know there's going to be a problem if you're funding groups that are engaged in violence. There's going to be a problem if you're funding or having ties to groups that are funding the Hamases of the world, etc. It's a different world post October 7th, and not only what happened that day, but the horrific war that followed, and it even began to bleed across borders into the Gulf with the Israeli strike on Hamas headquarters in Doha. None of us want that anymore. We're taking the Muslim Brotherhood problem very seriously. We want your help. If we're doing it in such a way that we're not designating the Muslim Brotherhood writ large, which I don't think we can do under our laws anyway, and then we pick and choose who we target first and try and get Qatari and Turkish buy-in slowly. I'm not saying this is going to be comfortable or quick or that it'll work at all, but there will be an opportunity.
Last question real quick. Alex, I think this one is for you, if you can answer it in 30 seconds. This may be a tall order, but could sedition laws be explored as an avenue to curb the Muslim Brotherhood's influence in the United States? Alex, sedition law?
So there are sedition laws. The definition very broadly is a conspiracy to oppose by force the authority of the United States. And that seditious conspiracy would be, I think, the most analogous to what this question is. And that is a tough statute that has a patchy history, but it depends on your evidence. I mean, if you have a group of people who are conspiring with one another, it has been applied to, and again, not with success, but to a domestic terrorist group. There in the Stone case. But if you can show that there is a conspiracy among individuals to oppose by force the authority of the United States, and you have the evidence, have at it.
I don't think we're there yet. As a group writ large, the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't think as prosecutors we could prove that against the Muslim Brotherhood writ large. That's what I'm trying to get at.
As with everything, it depends on your evidence.
Right. Okay, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists, Matt Levitt, Edmund Fitton Brown, and Alexandra Hughes for their time today. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we can get you on another panel on another day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Barry.